What happens when a trusted billionaire pastor, admired by millions, crosses the line and abuses his personal assistant? Unknown to him, she carries a deadly secret. When he receives the devastating news of his own diagnosis, a man of faith spirals into darkness. Will guilt and fear drive him to murder, or will the truth finally expose his sins? The story that unfolds will challenge everything you thought you knew about justice, power, and redemption. In the bustling city of Atlanta, where wealth and power went hand in hand, Reverend Gregory Howell was a man who commanded the room. A towering figure both physically and metaphorically, he had built an empire that spanned continents. His church, global ministry empire, his followers numbered in the millions, and his net worth was reported to be in the billions. With his wealth, his church was more than just a place of worship. It was a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of faith. People followed him not only for his spiritual guidance but also for his wealth and influence. He was a billionaire, with everything at his fingertips. But behind the glitzy surface, beneath the tailored suits and the holy aura, there was something dark lurking within. Behind the pulpit, beneath the facade of a man devoted to God, there lay a dark truth. Howell was a predator. He knew how to manipulate the masses. His speeches were powerful, drawing in crowds of thousands who believed every word he spoke. He preached about love, about kindness, about faith. But the truth was, he lived a life of contradictions. In private, he was a man driven by power and lust, and his personal assistant, Sarah Williams, would come to learn just how far he would go to get what he wanted. Sarah, a young woman in her mid-20s, had never imagined herself as a part of this world. A college graduate working to make ends meet, she had been recruited by Howell's ministry as his personal assistant. At first, the job had seemed like a dream, a chance to work with one of the most influential men in the world. But little did she know, she was about to be sucked into a nightmare. She was bright, intelligent, and ambitious. She had dreams of making a name for herself in the world of business and politics, and she saw working with the pastor as a stepping stone to achieving those goals. She had been chosen for the job because of her impeccable reputation and her ability to handle the delicate tasks that came with being the assistant to one of the world's most powerful religious figures. But as she spent more time with him, she began to notice cracks in the facade. Pastor Edwards was not who he appeared to be. He had a temper, and he demanded far more from her than any professional relationship should entail. Sarah admired Pastor Howell. She admired his intelligence, his charm, and the way he spoke so passionately about faith. But admiration quickly turned into dependence, and dependence soon gave way to manipulation. Howell, ever the master of control, began to use his position to demand more from Sarah in both subtle and overt ways. He pushed boundaries, testing the waters with jokes that felt uncomfortable, with praise that bordered on obsessive. And Sarah, wanting to keep her job and please her employer, had no choice but to laugh off his advances. She ignored the warnings of friends who told her she was being used. She ignored her own gut feelings that something wasn't right. But then the line between professional and personal blurred, and Sarah found herself in a situation she couldn't escape. It started with harmless comments, innocent compliments about her appearance, late-night meetings to discuss the church's finances, conversations about future investments, and how they could expand the ministry to other continents. But then, the lines between professionalism and something more sinister began to blur. Pastor Howell made Sarah feel special, like she was the only one who understood him, the only one who could truly help him achieve his dreams. He began to invite her into his personal space, the space where no one else could enter. His private office, away from the public eye, became a trap for Sarah. Sarah, still naive, accepted these comments as what they appeared to be, simple praise. She never imagined that they were leading to something far darker. One night, after a particularly long meeting, Pastor Howell asked Sarah to stay back. He said he wanted to discuss an upcoming charity event, something that was very important to the church. Sarah, always eager to please, agreed. As she sat across from him, a glass of water in her hand, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air became heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. He complimented her on her work, telling her that she was more than just an assistant to him, that she was someone he could trust, someone he relied on. And then, in an unexpected moment, he made his move. In one swift motion, he reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers, a look in his eyes that chilled her to the core. It was the look of a predator, not the shepherd of a flock. Before she could react, he stood up, and in an almost predatory manner, approached her. His words were smooth, coaxing her into a corner where she couldn't escape. Despite every fiber of her being telling her to run, she was paralyzed, trapped in a situation she couldn't understand, let alone get out of. His tone was different, colder, more calculated. He complimented her again, this time on her appearance, in ways that made her feel uneasy. "You know," he said, stepping closer to her, "I'm not just proud of your work, Sarah. You've been such a blessing in my life." His words lingered in the air, heavy and threatening, as he reached out to touch her arm. Sarah recoiled instinctively, but Howell, sensing her discomfort, quickly backpedaled. "Sorry, I feel a connection with you. You've become more than just my assistant." Sarah stood frozen, her heart racing. She could feel the power imbalance in the room, the weight of his stature pressing down on her. She wanted to leave, to walk out, but something kept her rooted in place. The fear that if she left, she'd lose everything. That was the moment when Howell's manipulations became something more sinister. He moved toward her, and before she could protest, he kissed her. The shock, the disgust, the feeling of betrayal rushed through her. She tried to push him away, but his grip tightened. He was too strong, and as he overpowered her, Tasha's world shattered. Sarah's body went numb as Pastor Howell's assault continued. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the smell of fear and power. She had no escape, no way to break free from the man who had betrayed her in the most intimate way possible. Afterward, she lay in the corner of the office, tears streaming down her face, her body bruised and broken in ways she hadn't thought possible. She didn't know how long she stayed there, but when she finally managed to get up, she stumbled toward the door, her head spinning, her legs shaking beneath her. Howell didn't apologize. He didn't even acknowledge what had just happened, as if it had been nothing more than an accident, a simple misunderstanding. "I hope you don't tell anyone," he said casually, as though nothing had changed. "People might get the wrong idea." Sarah didn't know what to think. She didn't know what to do. She had just been assaulted by a man she had once looked up to, a man with the power to destroy her. To her horror, she realized she was utterly alone. The trauma of that night didn't end with the assault. The shame, the isolation, the humiliation, it all came rushing at her in waves. But even as she faced the depths of her emotional torment, there was something deeper brewing inside her, something she hadn't fully acknowledged yet. A secret, a horrible secret, that she carried alone. The fact that she had been diagnosed with HIV a year prior. No one knew. Her family didn't know. Her friends didn't know. Not even Pastor Howell knew. She had been managing the condition with medication, keeping it controlled, hidden from the world. She had lived in constant fear of the moment when it would be revealed. And now, with what had happened in Pastor Howell's office, she was not only living in fear of exposure but also in a deep, shameful silence. But there was an undeniable part of her that couldn't ignore the twisted satisfaction she felt. She hated herself for it, but it was there, bubbling under the surface. She had done it. She had given him a dose of his own poison. The night of the assault marked a turning point. Pastor Howell had raped Sarah in his office, and in doing so, she unknowingly transferred the virus to him. She didn't tell anyone about the attack. She couldn't. Who would believe her? Not with the immense power he held. Not when he could make or break careers with a single word. She kept quiet, living in fear, trapped by the shame and the pain of what had happened, but feeling somewhat happy that she left her molester a parting gift, a gift that would be with him for the rest of his life. Though Sarah was devastated, something within her also stirred with a dark sense of justice. She knew the risk she was taking. She knew the consequences that could come from exposing him to the virus. But when he had overpowered her in that office, she had felt helpless. In the moment of her violation, she had felt the full weight of the power he held over her. Yet, deep down, As she lay there, trembling and broken, there was a small, rebellious voice inside her. This is the price he will pay. She hadn't planned it. In fact, she had tried to push the thought aside, focusing on her survival, her health, trying to move on from the nightmare. But the more she thought about it, the more a sick satisfaction consumed her. She had kept the secret of her condition from him on purpose. She hadn't told him, hadn't given him a hint. It had been her one weapon in an ocean of powerlessness. She knew it wasn't right. She knew it wasn't justice in the traditional sense. But in that moment, it felt like a cruel form of retribution. The moment that he had taken what he wanted from her, he had unknowingly signed his own fate. Sarah hadn't been foolish. She knew the risks she was taking, and she knew the consequences of infecting someone with HIV. But the truth was, Pastor Howell deserved to face the consequences of his actions. He deserved to experience the same kind of helplessness and fear that she had. Perhaps this was the only way for him to understand what it meant to be vulnerable, to understand the price of abusing his power, to feel the vulnerability of being exposed, like she had been. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to notice a change in Pastor Howell. His demeanor shifted. He became distant, almost paranoid. He would stare at her with a kind of calculating gaze, as though something were off, as though he could sense the invisible weight hanging between them. He didn't know, not yet, but something in his gut told him that Sarah had something to do with it. But Sarah never wavered. She kept her distance, maintained her professionalism, her composure. Every day she came into the office, she watched him, her heart racing every time their eyes met. She knew he had no idea, but the power she felt in keeping that secret was intoxicating. There was a part of her that took solace in the fact that he was now walking around with the same ticking time bomb inside him that she had lived with for so long. The same virus that had defined her secret life was now his, and he didn't even know it. Despite the fear that gnawed at her, fear of what he might do if he ever found out, there was something deeply satisfying about knowing that the man who had violated her was now walking a path of uncertainty, living in the shadow of a disease he had no control over. The balance of power, in some strange way, had shifted. Sarah wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a silent agent of karma, watching as Pastor Howell began to lose his grip, watching as the pieces of his perfect, untouchable life started to crack. It was an ordinary Tuesday when Pastor Howell walked into the upscale clinic, an air of arrogance surrounding him. He had spent the last few weeks feeling increasingly uneasy, like something was off. It started with the strange symptoms, a persistent cough, some fatigue, an odd soreness in his throat that wouldn't go away. But he dismissed them at first. After all, he was Pastor Howell, the man who could do no wrong, the untouchable leader, the embodiment of health and spiritual strength. He had preached countless sermons about faith, about healing, about protection from harm. The idea that something as insignificant as illness could affect him seemed almost laughable. But the symptoms persisted. They worsened. One night, he had coughed up a little blood, and it sent him into a panic. For the first time, Pastor Howell felt vulnerable. His world, which had always been so perfectly constructed, began to crumble beneath him. And so, he made the decision. He would go to the doctor, get tested. It was just a precaution, he told himself. Nothing to be concerned about. After all, men like him didn't get sick, not in a world where they were blessed by God, not in a life so full of success and protection. The moment he sat down in the sterile white room, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic, Pastor Howell had no idea that his life was about to change forever. The doctor, a middle-aged man with the calm demeanor of someone who had seen 1,000 troubled souls, looked at him with a kind of practiced empathy. He spoke gently as he discussed the tests, reminding Howell that the results would take a couple of days. Howell nodded, trying to maintain his composure, his ego swelling with the belief that this was just a formality. But deep inside, doubt began to fester. He couldn't explain it, but something about this felt different. A nagging feeling, like a dark cloud that hovered over him, whispered that the results wouldn't be what he expected. 2 days later, Pastor Howell stood in front of the doctor once again. This time, the air was colder. The doctor's eyes were serious, and the papers in his hand seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. The moment the doctor spoke, Howell's world tilted. "Pastor Howell, I'm afraid the tests came back positive," the doctor said, his voice steady but with a trace of sympathy. "You've tested positive for HIV." The words hit Howell like a punch to the gut. For a long moment, he couldn't process what was happening. The room seemed to spin around him. HIV. The one thing he never thought would touch him. How could this be? How could this happen to him? A man so righteous, so careful. A man who stood above the flaws of the world, guiding his followers with unwavering strength. How is that possible? Howell stammered, his voice shaking. He had to have heard the doctor wrong. There was no way this could be happening. His mind raced, trying to grasp onto any explanation that could make sense of this madness. The doctor leaned forward, speaking gently. HIV is transmitted through certain bodily fluids, through unprotected sexual contact, sharing needles, or from mother to child during childbirth. You must have been exposed unknowingly. Unknowingly. Howell's voice was almost a growl now, his anger rising. "I've been careful. I've never been reckless." The doctor, trying to maintain professionalism, nodded. "I understand this is difficult, but HIV can be contracted even in situations where you feel protected. It doesn't discriminate based on who you are or what you've done." Howell's mind raced. This was impossible. He couldn't allow this. He was a man of God, untouchable. But his mind flashed to something dark, something he had tried to suppress. The one night, the one woman he had violated, the one time he had crossed the line into something unspeakable. Sarah. The first time he had been intimate with Sarah, the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right had lingered in the back of his mind. She had seemed so fragile, so vulnerable. She was new to his world, so easily manipulated, so willing to please him. The idea that she could have been infected with HIV didn't cross his mind, nor did he care. She was simply another conquest to add to his growing list, another source of gratification for a man who felt untouchable. He had been so blinded by his power, by his arrogance, that he didn't stop to consider the consequences. But now, as the diagnosis settled like a cold stone in his chest, he realized the horror. He could trace it back. It had to be her. There was no other explanation. Sarah. The name echoed in his mind like a death knell. Howell's world crumbled around him. His chest tightened, his vision blurred. He didn't want to believe it, but the pieces fit together. Sarah had been the only one he had been with in recent months. The symptoms, the slow progression of his illness, it all pointed to her. He had used her, taken her body without a second thought, without considering the risks. And now, here he was, paying the price for his sins. As the realization sunk in, something twisted inside Howell. Anger, shame, fear. But above all, fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of the public knowing. He could lose everything. His church, his reputation, the empire he had built on the trust of his congregation. It could all come crashing down if the truth came out. And Sarah, the quiet, obedient assistant, would be the one to expose him. She had the power now. She knew what he had done to her, and she knew the consequences. But there was also something else, a growing fury that consumed him. He felt cheated, betrayed. The woman who had been his victim, the one he had taken advantage of, had somehow gotten the better of him. She had infected him. The thought of it made his blood boil. How could she have done this? How could she have kept this from him? The anger consumed him, drowning out all reason. In a fit of rage and humiliation, Howell decided that Sarah had to be silenced. He couldn't let her ruin him. He couldn't let the truth leak out. His mind, clouded with fury, came to a deadly conclusion. She had to die. For Sarah, the news of Pastor Howell's diagnosis felt like a vindication, though not in a way she had ever imagined. The news spread quickly. Howell, the once great pastor, was now facing the consequences of his actions. He was no longer the untouchable figure. He was no longer in control. The world would now know that he was just like any other man, flawed and vulnerable. Despite the fact that Sarah had been through so much, Despite the pain, the betrayal, the emotional scars she carried, she couldn't help but feel a twisted satisfaction. She had, in a way, gotten her revenge. She had taken something from him that he could never get back. He had believed he was in control, that he could manipulate and abuse with impunity. But now he was exposed, facing the consequences of his own actions. And for Sarah, that was enough. The guilt she had carried for so long, the fear of what would happen if her secret was ever revealed, seemed to fade in that moment. The man who had used her, the man who had stolen her dignity, had now become the one who was exposed. In a strange, painful way, the power had shifted. The predator was now the prey. Despite the horrific circumstances, Sarah realized that she had, in some twisted form, reclaimed some of her power. She was no longer the helpless victim. She was a silent agent of justice. And though it couldn't undo the damage he had done to her, it was something. Something that allowed her to hold her head up just a little bit higher. As the dark storm of rage and humiliation clouded Pastor Howell's mind, he began to hatch a plan. A cruel, cold plan to silence Sarah, to keep his secrets buried forever. The thought of her, how she had manipulated him, how she had turned the tables, how she now held his life in her hands, pushed him further down a path of no return. He couldn't let her live, couldn't let her destroy everything he had worked for. She had to be erased. Completely. The idea came to him like a flash, a way to make her disappear without suspicion. A perfect setup, a way to lure her out of the public eye and take care of things. It was simple. He would create the illusion of an opportunity, a grand event that no one could resist, a fake international pastors' conference. The moment he began planning, Howell felt a twisted sense of power wash over him. He could manipulate this situation, control it, just like he had manipulated her all those months ago. She would never see it coming. He could make her believe that this was her chance to further her career, to make her mark in the church world. He would invite her to the conference and lead her into his trap. It would be the perfect execution of his sick plan. Pastor Howell was a master manipulator, and it didn't take much to get Sarah on board. He had always been able to control her with his charm, with his position as her boss, her mentor, the man who held her future in his hands. Sarah, with her quiet demeanor and trust in him, had always been eager to please. And so, when Howell approached her with the idea of attending an exclusive international pastors' conference, she didn't hesitate. It seemed like a golden opportunity, an all-expenses-paid trip to a prestigious event with leaders from around the world. As she sat across from him, Howell smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His words were kind, reassuring, as always, but there was a hardness underneath them, a dangerous edge that Sarah couldn't recognize yet. He spoke about the final preparations for the trip, offering her a drink, one that she had accepted without hesitation. After all, she trusted him. He was her pastor, her mentor, the man she believed had only the best intentions for her. The conversation shifted to the real purpose of the trip, an opportunity to discuss her future with the ministry, her role in the church, her ambitions. Howell leaned in closer, his voice low and smooth as he spoke. His words were intoxicating, pulling her in, reassuring her of her place in his world. But as Sarah relaxed, unaware of the danger closing in on her, Howell's mind was elsewhere, focused on the sick, twisted goal he had set in motion. As they continued to talk, he subtly maneuvered the conversation to a more personal tone, touching on their previous encounters. He asked her if she remembered the night they had shared, the night that had ultimately led to her HIV diagnosis. Sarah's heart dropped as her mind flicked back to that moment. The abuse, the betrayal. She had worked hard to bury that memory, to bury the shame, the anger, but now, here it was again, brought to the surface by his words. She felt nauseous, but she didn't let it show. She simply nodded, trying to keep her composure, keeping her emotions in check. It was then that Howell's true nature revealed itself. He stood abruptly and walked behind her. His movements were swift, too quick for Sarah to register fully. Before she could react, he pressed a hand to her shoulder, his fingers digging into her skin in a way that felt wrong, too rough, too possessive. Her breath caught in her throat, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice low and controlled. "I know you think I've been kind to you, but this is all for your own good. I'm doing this because I care about you. You don't understand, but you will." The words didn't make sense, and for a brief moment, panic surged in Sarah's chest. What did he mean by that? What was happening? Before she could process the growing fear inside her, Howell's grip tightened on her shoulder. His fingers moved down her neck, to her chest, and she froze. Her heart raced, her mind screamed for her to get up, to run, but her body was paralyzed with fear. "You have to understand, Sarah," Howell continued, his voice now turning dark and menacing. "You're the one who did this to me. You've ruined me. I'm paying for your mistake, and now you'll pay for it too." Sarah's eyes widened, her breath shallow as she realized what was happening. The man who had once been her mentor, her pastor, was now the predator. Her mind was frantic, but it was too late. The past few weeks of feeling uneasy, of sensing that something was off, came crashing together in a brutal moment of clarity. In a blur of violent motions, Howell snapped. The rage that had been building inside him for weeks, for months, finally erupted in a blind, uncontrollable fury. He pulled Sarah back violently, slamming her into the chair. She gasped, her vision swimming with tears, but it was too late to escape. With shaking hands, he grabbed the phone on his desk, dialing quickly. It was as though the world around him had disappeared, leaving only Sarah, vulnerable, broken, helpless, and him, standing over her, controlling her fate. Sarah fought with everything she had left. She clawed, kicked, screamed, but Howell's anger was like a force of nature. His hands closed around her throat, tighter, harder, until her body went limp. Her eyes slowly closed, the light fading from them as her final breaths were stolen from her. Howell held on, unable to stop, lost in his rage, consumed by the need to destroy the one person who could bring him down. When Sarah's body went still, Pastor Howell stood over her, panting with exertion, looking down at her lifeless form. For a brief moment, the weight of what he had done settled on him, but then a cold wave of satisfaction washed over him. He had silenced her. He had erased her from his life. She would never expose him now. But as he looked down at her, something stirred in his gut, a recognition of his own depravity. The moment passed quickly, drowned out by the growing need to hide the evidence, to make sure that no one would know what he had done. The body would be disposed of, he assured himself. No one would ever find her. And the empire he had so carefully built, his reputation, his ministry, everything, would remain intact. But deep down, even as he went through the motions, Howell knew this was the beginning of the end. After Pastor Howell's rage subsided and he was left staring down at Sarah's lifeless body, the grim realization of what he had done began to settle in. There was no turning back now. The act was irreversible, but if he wanted to avoid being caught, he had to think quickly, carefully. He needed to make it look like an accident, something that would divert suspicion and protect him from the consequences of his actions. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Howell had built his empire on lies, manipulation, and control. If anyone were to discover the truth now, it would be the end of everything he had worked for. Pastor Howell stepped back, surveying the scene. The office was still, eerily quiet. Sarah's body lay slumped in the chair, her neck bruised from the strangulation, her face twisted in the final moments of horror she had endured. Howell quickly moved into action, his mind working at full speed. He grabbed her lifeless body and dragged it from the chair, making sure that her limbs were positioned awkwardly, as if she had tripped and fallen, her final moments of life filled with desperation. He moved quickly, determined to make everything look like an accident. He shoved a stack of papers from the desk to the floor, sending them scattering across the carpet. Papers, pens, and files were strewn everywhere, creating a scene of disarray that could suggest a struggle. Then, he placed Sarah's body at the foot of the desk, making sure her head rested on the floor at an unnatural angle, as if she had lost her balance and fallen backward. The final touch, a toppled chair beside her, would help make the scene appear more realistic. Howell stepped back, admiring his work. The scene now looked like a tragic accident, one that could be explained away as a fall. He felt a brief pang of guilt, but it quickly passed. He knew this was his only option, the only way to get out of the mess he had created. With a shaky breath, he reached for his phone. He needed to act fast, to call for help, to make sure everything seemed plausible. He dialed the number for emergency services, his hands trembling slightly as he held the phone to his ear. He had rehearsed the words in his mind, preparing for this moment. "Hello, this is Pastor Howell," he said, his voice tight but steady. "I need help. There's been an accident at my office. My assistant, Sarah, she fell. I found her on the floor. She's unconscious. Please, hurry. I think she might be dead." The call was short but effective. The emergency responders assured him they would be there shortly, and Howell quickly ended the call, pacing the floor nervously. He had to keep up the act. The police would be coming soon, and he had to remain calm. He couldn't let anyone suspect him. It didn't take long for the police to arrive at Howell's office. The flashing lights and the sound of sirens filled the night air as officers rushed inside, followed by paramedics. Howell greeted them with a mixture of concern and feigned surprise, pointing towards Sarah's body, which was now positioned exactly as he had arranged it. The paramedics quickly went to work, checking Sarah for signs of life, but it was obvious even to them that she was beyond help. One of the officers asked Howell how he had found Sarah. "I came in to check on her," Howell explained, his voice cracking with false emotion. "I was planning to go over the details of the trip with her. She had been helping me with the conference, but when I arrived, I found her like this. She must have tripped and fallen. I don't know what happened." The police officers exchanged skeptical glances, but Howell's performance was convincing enough to keep their suspicion at bay for the moment. The scene appeared to be a tragic accident, and though the officers took note of the unusual circumstances, there was no immediate indication of foul play. They asked Howell a series of questions about the events leading up to Sarah's death, but he stuck to his story. He was the concerned boss, the devastated pastor, a man who had just found his trusted assistant dead in her office. He even allowed the officers to examine the office, his calm demeanor betraying nothing but the concern he had feigned. But as the days passed, things began to take a darker turn. Despite Howell's best efforts to cover his tracks, cracks began to appear in his carefully constructed story. The investigation into Sarah's death was thorough, and as the police dug deeper into the details of the incident, a pattern started to emerge. There were too many inconsistencies, too many things that didn't add up. Sarah's autopsy report revealed something chilling. She had been murdered, not from a fall, but from strangulation. The bruises on her neck were consistent with being held tightly by someone's hands. The position of her body was not consistent with a simple fall, and the scene appeared staged. The police then began to look more closely at Howell's relationship with Sarah. Witnesses came forward, detailing a history of inappropriate behavior and tension between the two. Some employees in the church spoke of Sarah's discomfort with Howell's advances, and though many dismissed it at the time, it began to paint a very different picture of the relationship between the two. It was no longer just a case of a tragic accident. The investigation was pointing towards something far more sinister. Furthermore, the police discovered that Howell had recently been diagnosed with HIV, a fact that seemed to coincide with Sarah's diagnosis. The pieces began to fall into place. It became clear that Sarah had infected Howell during their sexual encounter, a fact that seemed to have enraged him beyond reason. The motive for the murder was no longer a mystery. It was revenge, fueled by pride and the need to protect his reputation at all costs. The turning point came when the police obtained security footage from Howell's office building. The footage, which had been conveniently overlooked earlier, showed Sarah entering the office building that evening. However, what the footage revealed next was even more incriminating. Howell's car was parked in the building's garage, and just moments after Sarah had entered the building, he followed her inside. The footage was damning. Howell had lied. With the evidence mounting against him, Howell was arrested. He was charged with murder, and the investigation revealed a deeply disturbing pattern of abuse, manipulation, and lies. The media quickly caught wind of the story, and the public was shocked to learn of the pastor's dark secret. The man who had built a ministry on trust and faith was revealed to be nothing more than a predator, willing to kill to protect his reputation. The trial was a media circus. The courtroom was filled with reporters, onlookers, and victims who came forward to tell their stories of manipulation and abuse at Howell's hands. The prosecution laid out the evidence against him: his HIV diagnosis, the suspicious circumstances surrounding Sarah's death, and the numerous lies he had told to cover his tracks. They painted a picture of a man driven by pride, anger, and a need for control. Throughout the trial, Howell remained stoic, but there were moments when his facade cracked, when he realized that there was no escaping the truth. He had murdered Sarah. He had taken a life, not just out of revenge, but out of his own twisted need to preserve his status. In the end, the jury found Howell guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The sentence was a sobering reminder of the darkness that had taken root within him, the darkness that had led him to take the life of an innocent woman. As the gavel fell and Howell was escorted out of the courtroom, the survivors of his abuse could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Justice had been served. Pastor Howell, the man who had hidden behind a mask of piety and power, had been unmasked and held accountable for his crimes. The death of Sarah, though tragic, had finally brought the truth to light. For Sarah, the justice she never got to see in her lifetime had finally been served. Pastor Howell would spend the next 2 decades in prison, the consequences of his actions catching up to him. The world would remember him for what he truly was: a predator, a liar, and a murderer. And while nothing could ever bring Sarah back, the truth had been uncovered. The darkness had been exposed, and justice had prevailed. If you found this story shocking and want to stay updated on more intense, thought-provoking true crime stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think justice truly looks like in a world of hidden truths? Don't miss out.